Naomi Brooks' quiet reply lingered in the air long after she had spoken. Everyone is somebody to someone, sir. There was no anger in her voice, no challenge, only quiet conviction. For a brief moment, even the soft piano music seemed to disappear beneath the silence that had settled across Bennett House. Richard Bennett studied her expression, expecting embarrassment, perhaps even an apology. Instead, he found something that unsettled him far more. Peace. She had not lowered her eyes in defeat. She had simply accepted that kindness did not require permission from anyone standing in front of her. Richard gave a short, humorless smile. Confidence is admirable. He glanced toward the silver tray she still carried with steady hands. Just remember where it belongs. Naomi nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. Without another word, she turned and continued serving the surrounding tables as though nothing unusual had happened. Her pace never changed. She quietly refilled water glasses, replaced folded napkins, and thanked each guest who accepted a meal. She treated the billionaire who had just humiliated her exactly the same way she treated every other person in the room. Emily watched from the nearby service station with disbelief. How can she stay so calm? She whispered. Frank, the senior maitre d', gently polished another crystal glass before answering. Because she decided a long time ago that someone else's opinion would never decide who she is. Emily looked toward Naomi again. I could never do that. Frank smiled faintly. Neither could most people. Across the dining room, Richard resumed greeting investors and charitable donors. Yet his attention drifted back toward Naomi more often than he realized. Every few minutes he noticed another guest smiling warmly at her. She remembered names. She noticed empty glasses before anyone asked. She helped an elderly gentleman adjust his chair without interrupting the conversation taking place around him. It was invisible work performed with remarkable care. At one corner table sat a little girl no older than 8 beside her grandparents. Naomi placed a small plate of warm bread in front of the child before quietly asking, "Would you like butter or strawberry preserves?" The little girl smiled brightly. "Both, please." Naomi laughed softly. An excellent choice. As she returned a few moments later with the small dish, the little girl looked up at her with complete innocence. "Miss." Naomi smiled. "Yes. Why was that man mean to you?" Several nearby conversations quietly faded. Naomi glanced briefly toward Richard, who stood across the room speaking with 2 prominent business leaders. She looked back at the child. Sometimes people are carrying burdens we cannot see. The little girl frowned. Does that make it okay? Naomi gently shook her head. No. She smiled kindly. But it helps us choose kindness instead of becoming unkind ourselves. The child's grandmother quietly reached across the table and squeezed Naomi's hand. Thank you. Naomi nodded politely before continuing with her work. Richard had not heard every word of the conversation, but he noticed the grandmother smiling warmly as Naomi walked away. For reasons he could not explain, the sight irritated him. He turned toward his assistant. Who hired that waitress? His assistant checked a tablet. Naomi Brooks, sir. She has worked here for several years. Performance record? Excellent. Richard frowned slightly. Interesting. Before he could ask another question, a distinguished elderly gentleman entered the dining room using a polished wooden cane. Conversations paused as several guests immediately greeted him with respect. Frank quickly walked forward. Good evening, Mr. Harrison. Theodore Harrison smiled warmly. Good evening, Frank. His eyes slowly moved around the room before resting on Naomi. A look of quiet recognition crossed his face. Naomi had not noticed him yet. She was carefully helping another server organize dinner plates near the kitchen entrance. Theodore watched her for several silent seconds, his expression softening with unmistakable emotion. Frank noticed immediately. Do you know Miss Brooks? Theodore answered without taking his eyes off Naomi. Know her. A gentle smile appeared across his face. Young man, I have been hoping to find her for nearly 20 years. Across the room, Richard overheard the final sentence. For the first time that evening, genuine curiosity replaced certainty. He looked toward Naomi once more, suddenly wondering whether the woman he had dismissed as a nobody carried a story that no amount of wealth could have purchased. The words spoken by Theodore Harrison spread through the dining room more quietly than a shout ever could. I have been hoping to find her for nearly 20 years. Several guests looked toward Naomi Brooks with renewed curiosity. Richard Bennett remained where he was, his conversation with two investors suddenly forgotten. Theodore Harrison was not a man who exaggerated. At 78 years old, he was one of the country's most respected philanthropists, known for building children's hospitals and funding educational programs across America. If he said he had spent 2 decades searching for someone, there was always a reason. Frank smiled politely. Would you like me to bring Miss Brooks over? Theodore gently shook his head. No. He rested both hands on the top of his cane. She is working. Frank looked slightly surprised. Theodore continued softly. She should never have to choose between her responsibilities and someone else's curiosity. Those words quietly reached several nearby guests. Richard heard them as well. Something about the sentence unsettled him. Theodore had shown more respect for Naomi's work in a few seconds than Richard had shown all evening. Meanwhile, Naomi remained completely unaware of the growing attention surrounding her. She was helping Emily arrange dessert plates before checking the seating chart one final time. Table 14 has a guest with a nut allergy, Naomi reminded her gently. Emily nodded quickly. I almost forgot. Naomi smiled. That is why we work together. Emily hesitated before speaking. Miss Brooks. Naomi looked at her. Yes. Emily lowered her voice. Does what happened earlier bother you? Naomi paused only briefly. It would be dishonest to say it did not. Emily looked down. Naomi continued with a gentle smile. But if I allow one painful moment to control the rest of my evening, then I lose much more than my peace. Emily quietly absorbed every word. Across the room, Theodore watched the exchange with unmistakable pride. Richard slowly approached him. Mr. Harrison. Theodore smiled politely. Richard. You know the waitress? Theodore looked directly into Richard's eyes. Apparently much better than you do. Richard remained composed. You said you have been searching for her. Theodore nodded. Yes. Richard waited. Theodore looked toward Naomi again before answering. Actually. A faint smile crossed his face. I have been searching for someone like her. Richard frowned slightly. I do not understand. Theodore gave a quiet laugh. Not yet. Before Richard could ask another question, Naomi approached their table carrying a polished silver coffee service. Her expression remained warm and professional. Good evening, gentlemen. May I offer either of you fresh coffee? Theodore's smile immediately widened. I would be honored. Naomi carefully poured the coffee with steady hands before placing the porcelain cup in front of him. Cream or sugar? Theodore looked at her for a long moment before answering. Black, thank you. Naomi nodded. Excellent choice. She turned politely toward Richard. Would you care for a refill, sir? Richard looked at her silently for several seconds. There was no trace of resentment in her face. No hidden sarcasm. She addressed him with exactly the same respect she offered Theodore Harrison. Yes, Richard finally answered. Naomi poured his coffee with equal care before placing the silver pot back onto the tray. Theodore quietly studied her face. Miss Brooks. Naomi smiled warmly. Yes, sir. May I ask you a personal question? If I am able to answer it. Theodore nodded gently. Did your mother ever tell you about a snowy night in Boston nearly 20 years ago? Naomi's hand stopped for the first time that evening. Only for a heartbeat. Her calm expression softened with unmistakable surprise. She did. Theodore slowly removed a worn leather wallet from inside his suit jacket. From a hidden compartment, he carefully unfolded a faded newspaper clipping that had clearly been preserved for many years. He looked at Naomi with quiet emotion. Then, perhaps. He smiled gently. We have finally found each other. Richard watched the exchange without speaking. For the first time since entering Bennett House, certainty had completely disappeared from his face. He suddenly realized the quiet waitress he had called a nobody was standing at the center of a story he knew absolutely nothing about. Naomi Brooks looked at the faded newspaper clipping with quiet surprise. The edges had yellowed with time, and careful folds marked the places where it had been opened again and again over the years. She immediately recognized the photograph. It was one she had seen only once before inside an old family box that her mother kept on the highest shelf of their apartment closet. Theodore Harrison gently held the clipping as though it were something far more valuable than paper. "You recognize it," he said softly. Naomi nodded. "My mother showed it to me when I was a little girl." Theodore smiled with unmistakable relief. "Then I have not spent 20 years chasing the wrong memory." Around them, the nearest conversations quietly faded. Guests were no longer watching because a billionaire had spoken harshly to a waitress. They were watching because an unexpected story was beginning to unfold. Richard Bennett remained beside Theodore, saying nothing. He could not explain why he suddenly felt like the least informed person in the room he owned. Theodore carefully unfolded the newspaper completely. A black and white photograph showed a young African-American woman standing beside an ambulance on a snowy Boston street. Her winter coat was covered with melting snow, yet her smile remained calm. Naomi looked at the picture with unmistakable tenderness. "That is my mother," she whispered. Theodore nodded. "Angela Brooks." Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "You remember her name?" Theodore laughed quietly. "Some names deserve to be remembered forever." Richard looked at the newspaper clipping. The headline had faded too much to read clearly, but one sentence beneath the photograph remained visible. Theodore traced the words gently with one finger before reading them aloud. "Local woman helps stranger after winter accident before. Disappearing without leaving her name." Richard frowned. "Disappearing?" Theodore smiled sadly. "She never waited to be thanked." Naomi lowered her eyes. "That sounds exactly like her." Theodore folded the clipping halfway before continuing. 20 years ago, I was leaving a charity meeting during one of the worst snowstorms Boston had seen in decades. The ballroom had become almost completely silent. Even the musicians paused, sensing that something meaningful was happening. Theodore continued in his calm voice. "A delivery truck lost control on black ice. Another vehicle swerved. I slipped while trying to help someone else." He smiled faintly. "Before anyone reached me, your mother was already there." Naomi listened without interrupting. Theodore's eyes softened. "She stayed beside me until the ambulance arrived." He laughed gently to himself. "She even argued with the paramedics because she thought they were moving me too quickly." Several guests smiled quietly. Theodore continued. "When I woke up the next morning, she was gone." Naomi nodded. She always believed kindness was not supposed to leave a bill behind. Theodore looked at her with admiration. "Exactly." Richard remained perfectly still. He glanced toward Naomi, then back toward Theodore. "If this happened 20 years ago." He hesitated. "Why have you been looking for her ever since?" Theodore answered without hesitation. "Because gratitude delayed too long becomes regret." The sentence settled deeply into the room. Theodore continued. "For years I asked hospitals, community organizations, churches, and newspapers whether anyone knew who the young woman was." He smiled sadly. "No one ever did." Naomi spoke quietly. "My mother never told anyone." Theodore nodded. "That does not surprise me." Richard found himself studying Naomi differently now. Not because he knew the entire story. He clearly did not. But because every piece he learned seemed perfectly consistent with the woman standing before him. She helped without seeking attention. She worked without demanding recognition. She accepted kindness with humility. Theodore slowly looked from Naomi to Richard. His warm expression became more thoughtful. "There is one part of the story I have never understood." Richard listened carefully. Theodore looked back at Naomi. "Your mother left something with the paramedics that night." Naomi's brow furrowed slightly. "She did." Theodore nodded. "A sealed envelope." He paused before finishing quietly. "It was addressed to someone whose name I recognized immediately, yet I never discovered why." Richard felt an unexpected uneasiness settle into his chest as Theodore slowly turned the faded newspaper clipping over, revealing the outline of an old envelope preserved carefully behind it. The name written across the front was still perfectly clear. Richard Bennett could not take his eyes off the faded envelope resting behind the newspaper clipping. Although the paper had aged over 2 decades, The handwriting remained remarkably clear. Theodore Harrison carefully held it without opening it, as though preserving a promise that had waited years to be fulfilled. Naomi Brooks leaned forward slightly, her expression filled with quiet curiosity rather than excitement. "My mother never mentioned an envelope," she said softly. Theodore nodded. "I only learned about it because one of the paramedics handed it to me after I was discharged from the hospital." Richard spoke for the first time in nearly a minute. "If the envelope was given to you, why was it never delivered?" Theodore smiled sadly. "Because it was never meant for me." He gently turned the envelope so both Naomi and Richard could see the front. Across the aged paper, written in careful blue ink, were the words, "For the Bennett family. Please deliver only if it is truly needed." Richard felt an unexpected chill despite the warmth of the elegant dining room. "The Bennett family?" Theodore looked directly at him. "Yes." Richard frowned. "My family." Theodore nodded once. "That is why I never opened it." Silence settled across the nearest tables once again. Even guests who could not hear every word sensed something deeply important was unfolding. Naomi stared at the envelope. "I have never seen that before." Theodore smiled gently. "Your mother trusted that someday the right moment would arrive." Richard slowly folded his arms, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Did you ever meet my father?" Naomi shook her head. "No, sir." Theodore answered instead. "Neither did Angela after that night." Richard looked confused. "Then why would she write to my family?" Theodore carefully slipped the envelope back behind the newspaper clipping. "That," he replied quietly, "is the question I have carried for 20 years. Naomi lowered her eyes, thinking of the countless evenings she had watched her mother quietly fold old newspaper articles before placing them back inside the same worn wooden box. As a little girl, she had asked more than once why those papers mattered. Her mother had always smiled and answered the same way. Some stories finish long after people stop talking about them. Naomi suddenly remembered another detail. There was also a small silver key. Theodore's eyes widened immediately. "You remember that?" Naomi nodded. "My mother kept it inside the same box." Theodore laughed softly with unmistakable relief. "Then everything fits." Richard looked from one to the other. "Would someone please explain what is happening?" Theodore rested both hands on his cane before answering. "Richard, your father and I built our first charitable foundation together." Richard nodded slowly. "I know. During those early years we promised each other something." Theodore's voice grew quieter. "If either of us ever met someone whose character represented everything we hoped our foundation would become, we would never let that person disappear from our lives." Richard listened carefully. Theodore continued. "After Angela helped me that night, I believed I had found that person." Naomi looked surprised. "My mother was just helping someone." Theodore smiled warmly. "Exactly." He turned toward Richard. "She never asked who I was." Another pause. "She never asked whether I was wealthy. She simply helped." Richard lowered his eyes. Those 3 words echoed painfully against his own behavior only an hour earlier. Theodore looked toward Naomi again. "I searched because I wanted your mother to know that goodness should never disappear unnoticed." Naomi's voice became almost a whisper. "She never wanted recognition." Theodore nodded. "I know." He smiled gently. "Which is precisely why she deserved it." Richard slowly stepped closer to the table. His confident posture had disappeared, replaced by genuine uncertainty. "May I ask one favor?" Theodore looked at him. "Of course." Richard glanced toward the unopened envelope before meeting Naomi's eyes for the first time without pride or judgment. "When the time comes." He paused carefully. "Would you allow me to hear whatever truth your mother believed my family needed to know?" Naomi studied his face in silence. Before she could answer, the maitre d' quietly approached their table and whispered into Theodore's ear. Theodore smiled softly before looking back at both of them. "It seems," he said, "the final piece of this story has just arrived." The maitre d' leaned toward Theodore Harrison and whispered only a few words, yet the gentle smile that appeared on the elderly philanthropist's face immediately softened the tension surrounding the table. He thanked the maitre d' with a quiet nod before looking back at Naomi Brooks and Richard Bennett. Would the two of you mind walking with me for a moment? Naomi answered first. Of course, sir. Richard nodded silently. Theodore slowly turned toward the rear of the dining room, where a smaller private lounge overlooked the city through towering windows. The space was quieter than the main dining hall, furnished with dark walnut bookshelves, leather chairs, and framed photographs documenting decades of charitable work. A fireplace glowed gently beneath a large portrait of Bennett House's founder. As the three entered, Theodore paused beside one of the photographs. It showed a much younger Richard standing proudly beside his late father at the opening of a children's education center. Richard smiled faintly. I remember that day. Theodore nodded. Your father spoke for nearly an hour. Richard laughed softly. Yes. Theodore smiled. But the only sentence people still remember came after the cameras were gone. Richard looked curious. What was it? Theodore's eyes rested on the photograph. The measure of success is not how many people know your name. It is how many people feel seen when you learn theirs. Richard's smile slowly faded. He had heard that sentence as a child, yet somewhere along the road to building billion-dollar companies, he had stopped living by it. Naomi quietly admired the photographs lining the walls. Most showed volunteers rather than executives, teachers rather than donors, hospital nurses rather than politicians. Theodore noticed her expression. Your mother would have appreciated these. Naomi smiled warmly. She always believed ordinary people quietly hold the world together. Theodore nodded. She was right. Just then the private lounge door opened once more. An elderly woman carrying a neatly wrapped wooden box stepped inside. Silver hair framed a kind face marked by gentle years rather than age alone. Theodore immediately stood. Margaret. She smiled warmly. Good evening, Theodore. Her eyes soon found Naomi. They filled with emotion almost instantly. You have your mother's smile. Naomi blinked in surprise. You knew her. Margaret nodded. Very briefly. She carefully placed the wooden box upon a nearby table before resting one hand on its polished lid. I was the emergency room nurse who cared for Theodore the night your mother brought him in. Richard slowly looked toward the box. What is that? Margaret smiled gently. Something I promised myself I would protect until the right family stood together. Theodore quietly placed the faded newspaper clipping beside it. Margaret carefully unlocked the small brass latch using a delicate silver key hanging from a thin chain around her neck. Naomi's eyes widened immediately. That key. Margaret nodded. Your mother asked me to keep it. She slowly opened the lid. Inside rested a carefully preserved envelope, several photographs, and a folded handwritten letter tied with a simple blue ribbon. Nothing inside appeared expensive. Yet every item had clearly been protected with extraordinary care. Richard found himself holding his breath. Theodore looked toward Naomi. Everything inside belongs to you. Naomi hesitated before gently lifting the folded letter with both hands. The paper was aged, but her mother's elegant handwriting remained unmistakable. Tears quietly gathered in her eyes before she even read the first line. She looked toward Margaret. You kept this all these years? Margaret smiled softly. Your mother asked me to wait until kindness mattered more than recognition. Richard lowered his eyes. Those words struck him more deeply than anyone realized. Theodore gently rested a reassuring hand upon Richard's shoulder. Sometimes life waits until people are finally ready to understand the truth. Naomi slowly untied the faded blue ribbon, unfolding the first page with trembling hands. The room became completely silent. Outside the lounge windows, the lights of New York shimmered against the night sky while laughter from the charity dinner drifted faintly through the closed doors. Naomi looked down at the opening sentence written by her mother's hand many years before. She quietly whispered the words as though hearing her mother's voice once again. If this letter has finally been opened, then someone has learned that every human being deserves to be seen before they are ever judged. Naomi Brooks held the letter with both hands as though it were something alive. The elegant handwriting across the yellowed paper instantly carried her back to childhood evenings spent beside her mother at a tiny kitchen table. Angela Brooks had never spoken loudly. She believed that the strongest truths rarely needed to raise their voices. Richard Bennett stood quietly across from her, no longer thinking like a billionaire or a businessman. For the first time in years he simply listened. Theodore Harrison and Margaret remained silent, allowing the room to belong to the woman whose words had traveled through 2 decades untouched. Naomi took a slow breath before continuing to read aloud. If you are reading this, then time has finally done what I could not. It has brought together people who are ready to hear one another before judging one another. The private lounge became completely still. Even the faint sounds from the dining room seemed distant. Naomi continued. The gentleman I helped never asked about my background. I never asked about his wealth. That night neither of those things mattered. There was only a person who needed another person. Richard lowered his eyes. Every sentence seemed to answer the mistake he had made earlier that evening. Naomi turned the page carefully. I have learned that kindness often disappears because people spend too much time deciding who deserves it. I hope that never happens to you. Margaret quietly smiled through moist eyes. That was exactly how she spoke, she whispered. Theodore nodded gently without taking his eyes off Naomi. The next paragraph caused Naomi to pause for a moment. She recognized her mother's careful choice of words immediately. There is something I must tell the Bennett family, although I do not know whether this letter will ever reach them. Richard slowly looked up. Naomi continued reading. The young gentleman who stopped beside the ambulance that snowy night reminded me of someone. Richard listened with growing attention. He reminded me that good families can accidentally become busy families, and busy families sometimes forget to notice the quiet people standing nearby. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The sentence landed with painful accuracy. Naomi continued. If he ever becomes a leader, please remind him that the people serving meals, cleaning floors, carrying boxes, opening doors, and welcoming strangers are not standing beneath him. They are standing beside the future he hopes to build. Theodore quietly exhaled. She saw everything. Naomi smiled faintly through tears. She always did. Richard found himself staring at the polished wooden floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The words did not accuse him. Somehow that made them even harder to hear. Naomi unfolded the final page. Tucked inside was a small photograph. It showed a much younger Angela Brooks standing outside a neighborhood community center, surrounded by smiling children holding books. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 simple words. Everyone deserves to feel remembered today. Naomi gently traced the handwriting with one finger before placing the photograph beside the letter. Richard looked toward it. She worked with children? Margaret smiled warmly. Every Saturday morning. Theodore nodded. Without accepting a single dollar. Naomi laughed softly through her emotion. She always said that children remembered kindness much longer than adults remembered success. Richard slowly walked closer to the table. Miss Brooks. Naomi looked at him. There was no distance in his voice anymore. Only sincerity. I spent years believing that leadership meant building something people admired. He glanced toward Angela's photograph. Your mother understood that leadership meant building people. Naomi folded the letter carefully before answering. She believed every person carries a story that cannot be seen from the outside. Richard nodded slowly. And tonight? He paused as emotion briefly caught his voice. I judged yours before I even knew the first sentence. Theodore rested his hand gently upon Richard's shoulder. The important question is no longer what happened earlier this evening. Richard looked at him. Theodore smiled kindly. The important question is what you choose to do after hearing her words. Richard looked once more at Angela's letter, then toward Naomi standing quietly beside the table. For the first time since entering Bennett House, he understood that the greatest inheritance a family could leave behind was not money, influence, or reputation. It was the ability to remind complete strangers that every human life carries equal dignity before anyone knows its story. For several quiet moments, no one in the private lounge spoke. Angela Brooks' handwritten letter rested gently upon the polished walnut table, its pages carrying a wisdom that seemed untouched by time. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Manhattan shimmered against the evening sky, while distant laughter from the charity dinner reminded everyone that life continued beyond the walls of the room. Naomi Brooks carefully folded the final page before placing it beside the faded photograph of her mother surrounded by smiling children. Her eyes remained fixed on the picture. She never told me she wrote this, Naomi whispered. Margaret smiled gently. She wanted the words to arrive when they were needed, not when they were convenient. Theodore Harrison nodded in agreement. That was always Angela. Richard Bennett remained standing a few steps away. The silence inside him felt heavier than any board meeting, business negotiation, or financial crisis he had ever faced. He had spent years believing that success came from making quick judgments. Tonight, every sentence in Angela's letter reminded him that the greatest mistakes often began the same way. He slowly approached the table. "May I see the photograph?" Naomi looked up. Without hesitation, she handed it to him. Richard studied the faded image carefully. Angela stood in the center of a small neighborhood library, surrounded by children holding books nearly as large as their arms. Every child was smiling. Angela was smiling too, not because someone had taken her picture, but because she was looking directly at one of the children instead of the camera. Richard noticed the detail immediately. "She was not looking at the photographer," he said quietly. Theodore smiled. "She was looking at people." Richard nodded slowly. "That seems to be the pattern." Margaret gently laughed. Angela always believed that moments mattered more than memories of moments. Naomi looked toward the window before speaking. Every Saturday morning she volunteered at that library. Richard turned toward her. "Did she ever tell you why?" Naomi smiled softly. "She used to say that a child who learns to love books will someday learn to understand people." Richard carefully returned the photograph. "I wish I had met her." Naomi answered with quiet honesty. "I think she would have liked you." Richard looked surprised. "Even after tonight?" Naomi nodded gently. She believed people should never be judged by their worst moment if they were willing to grow beyond it. Those words settled deeply into the room. Richard lowered his eyes. "I am beginning to understand why Theodore searched for her." Theodore folded his hands over his cane. "I searched because I believed kindness like hers should never disappear without leaving footprints." Margaret reached into the wooden box once more. "There is one more item." She carefully removed a small leather notebook no larger than the palm of her hand. The cover showed years of gentle use, but it had been preserved with extraordinary care. She handed it to Naomi. "Your mother asked me to protect this as well." Naomi opened the notebook slowly. The first pages contained simple handwritten reflections about ordinary days, helping neighbors, reading with children, caring for elderly residents, and encouraging strangers with small acts of kindness. There were no grand achievements, no headlines, only quiet moments that had changed someone's day. Richard watched Naomi turn each page with growing emotion. Then a folded piece of paper slipped gently onto the table. Naomi picked it up. It was a handwritten list titled, "People I Hope Never Feel Invisible." Beneath the title appeared occupations instead of names. Waitresses, janitors, security officers, housekeepers, delivery drivers, teachers, nurses, dishwashers, receptionists, custodians, volunteers. Naomi smiled through tears. She never wrote about important people. Theodore looked at the list and quietly corrected her. "No." He smiled warmly. "She wrote about people the world often forgets are important." Richard stared at the handwritten list for a long time before quietly taking a slow breath. He suddenly remembered every employee he had walked past without greeting, every server he had overlooked, every janitor whose name he had never learned. The realization was deeply personal. Angela Brooks had never met him, yet somehow she had described exactly the leader he never wanted to become. He looked toward Naomi with quiet sincerity. "Miss Brooks, I cannot change how I treated you earlier this evening." He paused before continuing. "But I can decide what kind of man walks out of this room." Naomi smiled gently. "That is all any of us can do." Theodore looked from Richard to Naomi, then toward the unopened doors leading back to the dining room. "The guests are still waiting." Richard nodded. This time, however, he understood they were not waiting for a billionaire. They were waiting to see whether a lesson in humanity would become a lasting change. Richard Bennett reached for the door leading back into the main dining room, but before his hand touched the polished brass handle, he stopped. He turned toward Naomi Brooks once more. "May I ask you one last question before we go back?" Naomi nodded gently. "Of course." Richard glanced down at the small leather notebook still resting on the table. After everything that happened tonight, After what I said to you. Why did you never tell me who your mother was? Naomi smiled softly, almost as though the answer had always been simple. Because my mother's story was never meant to become my shield. Richard remained silent. Naomi continued. If someone only treats me with kindness after learning where I come from, then they are not really seeing me. Theodore Harrison quietly closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the wisdom of her words to settle into the room. Margaret smiled warmly. She sounds more and more like Angela every minute. Richard slowly nodded. You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone. Naomi answered honestly. That would not have honored my mother. Richard lowered his eyes. You could have told every guest that I was wrong. Naomi gave a small smile. They already knew. For the first time that evening, Richard laughed quietly. Not because anything was amusing, but because the truth had finally become impossible to escape. Theodore rested both hands upon his cane. Then perhaps it is time. Richard looked at him. Theodore smiled gently. Go finish the evening the right way. Together they stepped back into the grand dining room. Conversations gradually softened as guests noticed them returning. Naomi resumed carrying her polished silver tray with the same quiet professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the night. Richard did not walk toward the honored donors or the photographers waiting near the entrance. Instead, he walked directly to the center of the ballroom where a small stage overlooked the entire room. The microphone still rested on its stand from the opening ceremony. He looked across the faces of business leaders, volunteers, employees, kitchen staff, musicians, and guests. Then he drew a slow breath. Ladies and gentlemen. The room fell completely silent. Richard looked first toward the serving staff gathered near the kitchen entrance before continuing. This evening began with a celebration of generosity. He paused. But I forgot the first rule of generosity. Several guests listened closely. You cannot claim to value humanity while failing to value the human being standing in front of you. His eyes found Naomi across the room. She stood quietly beside another server, her expression calm as always. Richard continued. Earlier tonight, I looked at a uniform instead of a person. His voice remained steady, but unmistakably sincere. I spoke words that no one deserves to hear. Around the ballroom, several employees quietly lowered their eyes. Richard turned toward them. To every member of our staff, I owe more than an apology. I owe you the respect that should never depend upon your position, your title, or the work you perform. He stepped away from the microphone and slowly walked toward the service station where Naomi stood. Every guest watched in complete silence. Richard stopped a respectful distance away. Miss Brooks. Naomi looked up. Yes, sir. Richard spoke clearly enough for the entire room to hear. When I called you a nobody, I revealed nothing about you. He paused. I revealed something about myself. No one moved. Richard continued. Tonight your mother's words reminded me that leadership begins with seeing people before judging them. He looked around the ballroom once more. Miss Brooks reminded me that dignity does not become greater because someone is wealthy, and it does not become smaller because someone serves dinner. Theodore Harrison quietly smiled from the back of the room. Margaret gently wiped away a tear. Emily stood beside Frank with her hands folded, unable to look away. Richard bowed his head slightly toward Naomi. I cannot erase the moment I created. He lifted his eyes again. But if you are willing, I would like the rest of this evening to remember your character instead of my mistake. Naomi looked around the dining room at the countless faces now watching with quiet understanding. Then she smiled with the same gentle warmth that had never left her all night. People remember kindness much longer than pride, she said softly. Let us give them something worth remembering. Ignoring the attention surrounding her, Naomi Brooks quietly returned to her work. She collected empty glasses, thanked each guest with the same gentle smile, and helped another server organize dessert plates before anyone realized assistance was needed. Nothing about her pace changed. Nothing about her attitude suggested she had become the center of the evening. Richard Bennett watched from several feet away, realizing that the greatest difference between them was not wealth or status. It was that Naomi had never allowed recognition to change the way she treated people. Theodore Harrison slowly approached Richard with his cane resting lightly against the polished marble floor. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Richard looked toward Naomi before answering. "I built companies by learning how to evaluate people quickly." Theodore nodded. "That skill can be useful." Richard sighed quietly. "Tonight it became my greatest weakness." Theodore smiled gently. "Only because you finally recognized it." Richard looked around the elegant dining room. Guests who had once spoken only with executives were now thanking servers by name. Volunteers shared tables with donors. Conversations no longer revolved around business deals alone. Something inside Bennett House had shifted. It had happened without a speech, without a policy, and without anyone demanding it. One act of quiet dignity had changed the atmosphere of an entire room. Emily carefully approached Naomi carrying a tray of desserts. "Thank you," she whispered. Naomi looked surprised. "For what?" Emily smiled shyly. "For showing me how to stay kind when someone is not." Naomi gently adjusted one of the dessert plates before answering. "Kindness is easiest when everyone is kind to us." She looked toward the guests with a peaceful smile. "Its real purpose appears when they are not." Emily nodded, silently carrying those words with her as she continued serving. Richard overheard every sentence. They sounded remarkably similar to Angela Brooks' letter. Yet Naomi never quoted her mother directly. She had simply lived those values for so many years that they had become part of who she was. A few moments later, Richard quietly walked toward the service station where Naomi was arranging fresh coffee cups. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Miss Brooks." She turned with the same calm expression. "Yes, sir." Richard hesitated before speaking. "May I help?" Naomi glanced at the stack of porcelain cups, then smiled warmly. "Certainly." Without ceremony, she handed him a neatly folded linen towel. "These cups have just been polished. They only need to be placed on the serving tray." Richard accepted the towel and carefully began arranging the cups exactly as Naomi demonstrated. At first his movements were slow and uncertain. Naomi offered small suggestions with quiet patience. "Leave a little space between the handles. It makes them easier to lift." Richard adjusted the arrangement immediately. "Like this." Naomi nodded. "Perfect." Nearby guests noticed the exchange but said nothing. The image spoke for itself. A billionaire who had once believed serving tables belonged beneath him was now listening carefully to the waitress he had publicly dismissed. Frank quietly folded his arms beside Emily. "Do you see that?" Emily smiled. "Yes." Frank looked across the room. "People can memorize leadership books for years." He nodded toward Richard. "Sometimes all it takes is one honest lesson from the right person." Theodore watched with quiet satisfaction. Margaret gently closed the wooden memory box before placing it back into Richard's hands. "This belongs with the Bennett family now," she said. Richard looked surprised. "It belongs to Angela." Margaret smiled kindly. Her words already belonged to Naomi. She gently touched the lid. "Now let this remind your family what truly matters." Richard accepted the box carefully, as though holding something more valuable than any business contract he had ever signed. He looked toward Naomi once again. She had already returned to helping another guest, smiling with the same warmth she had shown from the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her kindness had been performed for an audience. It had simply become her way of living. Richard understood then that the greatest truth revealed that night had never been hidden inside an old letter or preserved inside a wooden box. It had been quietly visible all along in the ordinary choices Naomi made every single day. The evening gradually settled into a calm rhythm once again. Soft piano music drifted through the elegant dining room while guests enjoyed coffee and quiet conversations beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet something invisible had changed. People no longer looked through the employees moving between the tables. They looked at them. They smiled. They thanked them by name. Naomi Brooks noticed the difference without drawing attention to it. As she refilled an elderly couple's coffee cups, the gentleman stood before accepting his drink. "Thank you, Miss Brooks," he said warmly. Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude. "You are very welcome, sir." At another table, a young entrepreneur shook hands with the dishwasher who had stepped into the dining room to help clear dessert plates. Nearby volunteers thanked the housekeeping staff as they quietly refreshed the room. Richard Bennett watched every small exchange from across the ballroom. Earlier that evening he had believed respect flowed downward from power. Now he understood that genuine respect moved freely in every direction. Theodore Harrison slowly joined him near one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights. "Quite a difference," Theodore said softly. Richard nodded. "The room feels different." Theodore smiled. "The room has always been the same." Richard looked around thoughtfully. Theodore continued. "The people have simply begun seeing one another." Richard quietly reflected on those words. He realized that wealth could purchase magnificent buildings, elegant dinners, and influential guest lists. It could never purchase the trust growing naturally inside the room tonight. That had been earned by one woman's character. A few moments later, Emily approached Naomi carrying a small envelope. "This was left for you." Naomi accepted it with curiosity. There was no name written on the outside. Inside rested a handwritten note. It simply read, "Tonight I learned the names of every employee working at my company because I never want anyone to feel invisible again. Thank you." Naomi smiled softly before folding the note and placing it beside her mother's photograph inside the small leather notebook. Richard happened to notice. "You are keeping it?" Naomi nodded. "Yes." Richard looked surprised. "It is anonymous." Naomi smiled gently. "Kindness does not become more valuable because we know who gave it." Theodore quietly laughed. Angela would have said exactly the same thing. Richard lowered his eyes with a thoughtful smile. "I believe she just did." Frank approached carrying a polished silver tray with fresh coffee. "Mr. Bennett?" Richard looked up. "Yes, Frank." Frank hesitated only briefly. "I have worked here for 28 years. Richard nodded respectfully. "I know." Frank smiled warmly. "Tonight was the first time you asked me how long I have been here." Richard felt the truth of those words settle deeply within him. "I should have asked years ago." Frank shook his head kindly. "The important part is that you asked." Richard extended his hand. Frank accepted it with a smile. Nearby employees quietly watched the simple exchange. No cameras captured it. No reporters wrote about it. Yet it became one of the most meaningful moments of the evening. Naomi continued collecting the final dessert plates while softly thanking every coworker who helped her. She never mentioned the letter, the wooden box, or the apology. She simply continued treating every person with the same dignity she believed they deserved before the evening had even begun. Richard watched her for a long moment before walking beside her once again. "Miss Brooks." She turned. "Yes, sir." Richard smiled with genuine humility. "Earlier tonight I believed I knew what made someone important." He glanced around the dining room where employees and guests now laughed together naturally. "Now I think importance has very little to do with wealth." Naomi adjusted the folded linen resting on her serving tray before answering. "The people who make others feel seen are usually the ones who matter most." Richard nodded slowly. He no longer heard those words as advice. He heard them as a responsibility. And for the first time in many years that responsibility felt far more valuable than success itself. As the evening drew closer to its end, Bennett House no longer felt like a place divided by wealth and position. It felt like a room where people had quietly remembered something they should never have forgotten. The final dessert plates had been cleared. Fresh coffee was served one last time. Guests lingered beneath the crystal chandeliers, not because of the luxury surrounding them, but because conversations had become unexpectedly meaningful. Naomi Brooks continued working with the same quiet focus she had carried from the beginning of her shift. She folded linen napkins, thanked the kitchen staff as they carried empty serving trays, and helped Emily organize the last coffee service before the evening concluded. Richard Bennett watched every small act with growing admiration. Earlier that night, he had searched for greatness in impressive accomplishments. Now he saw greatness inside ordinary moments repeated with extraordinary consistency. Theodore Harrison slowly approached the center of the dining room and lightly tapped his coffee spoon against a crystal glass. The gentle sound invited everyone's attention without interrupting the peaceful atmosphere. Conversations gradually faded. Theodore smiled warmly at the gathered guests. "Before we all leave tonight," he began, "I would like to say something." Every face turned toward him. He looked first at Richard, then toward Naomi. "Many years ago, I believed generosity meant writing checks. A few guests smiled knowingly. Theodore continued. Tonight I was reminded that generosity begins much earlier than that. He paused. It begins the moment we decide another person's dignity matters as much as our own. Complete silence settled across the room. Theodore slowly gestured toward Naomi. The young woman serving your dinner has quietly practiced that lesson every day without asking anyone to notice. He then looked toward Richard. And the gentleman standing beside her has reminded us that real character is measured not by never making mistakes, but by having the courage to correct them. Richard lowered his head respectfully. The applause that followed was gentle rather than overwhelming. It carried gratitude instead of excitement. Naomi looked almost uncomfortable receiving so much attention. She quietly smiled before returning her gaze toward the serving station, as though wondering whether another guest might still need coffee. Theodore laughed softly after noticing. There she goes again. Several guests smiled with him. Richard walked toward Naomi holding the small wooden memory box Margaret had entrusted to him. Miss Brooks. She turned. Yes, sir. Richard carefully placed the box in front of her. I have been thinking. Naomi listened quietly. Your mother's words should never belong to one family alone. He gently rested his hand upon the polished lid. With your permission, I would like to create a reading room inside the Bennett Foundation Children's Library. Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. Richard continued. It will be named in Angela Brooks' honor. Tears quietly gathered in Naomi's eyes. Richard smiled gently. Not because she became famous. He shook his head. Because she never tried to. Theodore nodded with unmistakable approval. Margaret softly wiped away another tear. Naomi looked down at the wooden box before answering. My mother always believed that books could teach children to recognize the humanity in people they had never met. Richard smiled. Then her story should continue teaching exactly that. Naomi slowly nodded. She would have been honored. Richard extended his hand, not as a billionaire greeting an employee, but simply as one person thanking another. Naomi accepted it with a warm smile. Around them, guests quietly applauded once more. No cameras flashed. No speeches followed. The moment belonged entirely to sincerity. As employees finished preparing the room for closing, Richard walked through the dining room one final time, stopping to thank every server, every cook, every dishwasher, every housekeeper, every security officer, and every member of the staff by name. He no longer hurried past the people whose work had quietly carried the evening. He recognized them, and as Naomi watched him disappear briefly into the kitchen to personally thank the culinary team before returning with the same humble expression, she realized the greatest truth revealed that night had never been hidden inside an old letter. The truth was that one act of genuine kindness, passed faithfully from a mother to a daughter, had quietly transformed the heart of a man who finally chose to see every person standing before him. The final guests slowly made their way toward the entrance of Bennett House, their quiet conversations blending with the soft piano melody that lingered beneath the crystal chandeliers. Candlelight reflected across polished walnut floors while employees carefully folded ivory table linens, gathered fresh flowers, and stacked the last polished silver trays. The evening had begun as another elegant charity dinner. It ended as something no invitation could have promised. Naomi Brooks gently closed the small leather notebook that had belonged to her mother, and placed it carefully inside the wooden memory box before handing it back to Richard Bennett. Richard looked surprised. This belongs to your family, he said softly. Naomi smiled with the same peaceful warmth she had carried throughout the entire evening. My mother's words were never meant to stay inside a box. Richard looked down at the polished wood resting in his hands. Naomi continued. If they help someone become kinder tomorrow than they were yesterday, then they are exactly where she wanted them to be. Richard nodded slowly, understanding that the greatest inheritance Angela Brooks had left behind had never been paper, photographs, or letters. It had been the way her daughter quietly lived every ordinary day. Theodore Harrison approached with Margaret beside him. He looked at Richard with a proud smile. Your father would have been grateful tonight. Richard lowered his eyes. I hope someday I become the kind of man he believed I could be. Theodore gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You already began. Across the dining room, Emily carefully finished arranging the final chairs before walking toward Naomi. Miss Brooks. Naomi turned. Yes. Emily smiled shyly. I do not think I will ever forget tonight. Naomi laughed softly. Neither will I. Emily hesitated before asking one final question. Do you think people really change? Naomi looked around the quiet room. Frank was thanking the kitchen staff before leaving. Guests were personally shaking hands with servers. Richard was helping one of the housekeeping employees carry a heavy storage box instead of walking past. Theodore and Margaret stood smiling together beneath the warm lights. Naomi answered without hesitation. I think people remember who they were meant to be. Emily looked around the room herself before smiling. I like that better. Richard quietly walked toward Naomi one last time before she prepared to leave. He extended his hand. Good evening, Miss Brooks. Naomi accepted the handshake warmly. Good evening, Mr. Bennett. Richard smiled. Earlier tonight I believe success was measured by what people built. He glanced toward the employees finishing their work together. Now I believe it is measured by how many people feel valued because they met you. Naomi gently shook her head. That belongs to everyone in this room. Richard smiled. Perhaps. He paused. But someone had to remind us first. Naomi picked up her neatly folded apron and prepared to leave through the employee entrance exactly as she had done after countless ordinary shifts. There were no photographers waiting. No reporters asking questions. No special celebration followed her. She simply wished everyone a pleasant evening before quietly disappearing through the hallway. Richard remained standing near the dining room entrance, watching the door close behind her. He realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Earlier that evening, he had looked at a woman wearing a server's uniform and decided she was nobody. The truth she revealed had nothing to do with hidden wealth, secret power, or forgotten influence. The truth was far simpler and far greater. A person's worth has never depended on the title they carry, the clothes they wear, or the table where they stand. It has always depended on the kindness they choose when no one believes they matter. As the final lights inside Bennett House slowly dimmed and the last candle was gently extinguished, the room fell into peaceful silence. The expensive decorations would be replaced before the next event. The flowers would fade. The tables would be set again. But everyone who walked out that night carried home something far more lasting than the memory of a beautiful dinner. They carried the quiet reminder that the easiest way to overlook greatness is to judge someone before learning their story, and the surest way to honor another human being is simply to see them.